Maybe you just bought your first ever IEM and you're trying to figure out this whole replaceable cable situation. Or maybe you're like me and you've been in this hobby for years and you're just looking for someone to commiserate with. Well, hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review. And in this episode of Waveguide, we're going to talk about everything you need to know about IEM cable connectors. Unless there's something I forget, we're going to talk about everything. We're going to talk about 2-pin cables versus MMCX cables, the differences, the pros and cons, as well as I'll give you some tips for using each of them. But I also want to end this video with kind of a plea to the IEM industry that we can make a better connector. I've got some ideas for it. We'll talk about that later. And I think it's going to make all of our lives better. And speaking of making our lives better, shout out to HiFiGo for making waveguide videos like this possible. I've got them linked down below if you want to check them out, but we'll talk about them more later. But with that said, let's get on with it. Okay, to start, just so we're on the same page, what we're talking about is IEMs with replaceable cables like this. Most IEMs in your monitors will have a replaceable cable where the earpiece itself can remove and detach from the cable. And this is the connector. This is the bit that we're going to be talking about. In this example, it's a 2-pin connector, but there's different styles, and we'll dive into those in a bit more. But the gist is just that most cables or most IEMs have replaceable cables, although I guess technically they don't all, which might make you wonder, okay, well, why would I want the cable to be replaceable in the first place? And I think there's 3 main reasons. Reason number 1 is just it's replaceable. It's more durable, right? So if you buy an IEM that costs $100, $300, thousands of dollars, people can spend that much on IEMs. If something goes wrong with the cable, you don't want to throw out the IEM and have to buy a new one. You can just go buy a new cable for, I don't know, like 20 bucks. You can get a pretty decent little cable and put it on your IEM and revive that IEM. Now you have a functional IEM. The second reason that you might want to replace the cable is just because you like the aesthetics, right? Like this is a nice looking IEM, but maybe you would want to swap it out with a cable that looks like this, or maybe a cable that looks like this. And there's different weights. You have some cables that are nice and thin, some are thick and heavyweight, and people just have different preferences. And that's, a big reason why people replace the cables on these things, honestly, is just for the aesthetic and the fit and the comfort and all that stuff. It's basically like jewelry. The third reason is sound differences, which I'm going to tell you right now, I don't really believe that cables make sound differences. If you want to know more about why, I did do a video, I'll have it linked up here, talking about cables and do they make a difference. And the general gist is no, I don't really think that IEM cables make a difference in terms of sound quality, but there are people out there that do. And well, that's one of the reasons that they replace their cables. So that's kind of that overview. Something else that you should know about cables is that there is a left and a right side. Let me extend this real quickly just to kind of show you. Obviously, there's 2 different earpieces for your left and right ears and 2 different ends of the cable, but they are in fact coded to the left and the right side. So it's important that you get the left and the right side correct. You can see here this earpiece has an R on it. And if you're looking at around the cable, well, you can see that this cable has a red dot on the right side. Typically, red indicates the right side, and sometimes there is a blue and sometimes there's not. I guess in this example, there is a blue that indicates left. Blue usually equals left. Sometimes you'll have cables where the connector or the color is, here's another example of a red and a blue, so you can kind of guess which one is red or left and right. Sometimes the connector isn't color-coded. Sometimes it's actually has the letters L and R written on it. Here's an example, right, where you've got the letter R written on the right side. And then sometimes there are cables where you've got one side coded, like this one is red, and then the other one's not coded. And you just have to use your brain in deduction to deduce. So this one's red, that one's right, ergo this one equals left. Not too complicated. Now, there are some, however, that are a little bit complicated because they don't do a very good job of labeling the cables, or sometimes it's just like hard to tell. Let me give you an example of a cable that's actually, this one's really opaque. Now, technically this one's not replaceable, but I wanted to use this as an example to show you there are no left and right indicators on this cable. In fact, the only indicator that separates them is that there is a groove cut into the side of one of these, and well, you might not know which one is left or right. I certainly didn't right out of the gate. Another example, let me look around here. I think this is probably my best example, would be this cable, right? It does have a small R written on there, but if you don't have a magnifying glass like you're looking at it right now, it's gonna be really hard to tell which side is left and right. So what I like to do is you can go onto YouTube, type in stereo test, and you just pull up a video that's basically gonna play audio through one channel at a time. And it'll tell you, I'm playing audio through the left channel. And then when you find that, you're gonna know that, okay, now this groove, now I know that that means the left channel. On a cable like this, where you kind of have to just, you can connect it and then get it right when you notice it. But something I like to do is add a little O-ring to the cable like this, which just indicates to me, reminds me that this is the right side. Here's kind of a, ooh, almost dropped that, almost a disaster. But this is my collection of red O-rings, which you can find for sale, I don't know, in a general hardware store. If you want to know the size on these, they are, I believe, 5 millimeters in diameter, the outer diameter, and then 2 millimeters on the inner diameter, which should be all the information that you need to know in order to go out and find these for yourself. But that's just kind of a pro tip on finding and identifying the left and the right channels. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight here while we're talking about this is just to highlight that, again, I've already alluded to this, there are different styles of connectors. Where was the tangent? Here we go. So this is a standard 2-pin connector. This is probably the most common. And again, we're going to dive into each of these in a little bit. This is an MMCX connector, which is also probably like the second most common connector. And then there's also some other connectors like this, which kind of looks like an MMCX, but it's technically not. This is an IPX connector. There's also Pentaconn connectors, which are similar. And that's just kind of the general lay of the land here with IEM cables. That's more or less what you need to know. So I guess we'll dive in and talk about each of these different connector styles and some tips for them specifically. All right, a quick overview on 2-pin connectors. And this is the one that we started with just to kind of show you a couple of different styles that there are out there. This is the most common style. This is, protruded 2-pin. It has somewhat of a large protrusion here, which is this bit of plastic that I'm highlighting here. Here's another example of a 2-pin connector, which let's pop that one off. It's a little bit stiff, but that's okay. You can see that the plastic protrusion here is a lot smaller, and that is a difference that you'll notice with some IEMs. So now what that difference means, you can see that on the IEM itself, here the connector is flush with the IEM, whereas on this example, the connector is kind of recessed. And in this case, well, you probably do want to use a cable that has a larger protrusion, which just makes it easier to fit deep in there and get a nice secure fit. Whereas when you're using a 2-pin cable on this IEM, it's not going to be really picky about whether you're using one with a shallow protrusion or a deep protrusion. I'll show you just to kind of highlight that, yeah, the one with the long protrusion will still work here. Just the only downside is that it's going to end up sticking up kind of tall on the IEM. So that can be maybe a bit of a limitation here. Another quick style here, and I'll just highlight this. This is actually my favorite style of 2-pin connector because it's kind of compatible with both. It is small enough that it works well with like a recessed connector here. So it does have a slight protrusion, but again, it's also like small enough that it doesn't look out of place when you use it on an IEM that has a flush connector. But then again, to show you on the tangent, which has that recessed connector, it works perfectly fine with that as well. So I generally like that. Now there's one more style of 2-pin connector I want to show you, which is the QDC style. This one is kind of a pain in the butt because it's just not as compatible, but it does also have some nice benefits to it. I'll pop it off just to kind of highlight for you. That is the 2-pin connector. And you can see that rather than it being recessed, the 2-pin connector is the part that's actually protruded, which means that on the cable itself, instead of having a protrusion, it has kind of its own kind of female end there. And what's nice about this is that you get, a nice, stable, tight connection. But the downside is that, well, this cable, this QDC style cable, for fairly obvious reasons, I can't use on this IEM, right? This will not function. However, going the other way around, you can use, let me see, this normal style 2-pin connector on this. This will function. Although you'll probably notice that it is a little bit on the tall side and not very attractive, I suppose. You might also worry about its stability and like force on those 2-pin connectors, which I think is with good reason. Anything else to talk about? I guess also just to highlight briefly, as I'm struggling with this, and maybe this is why, there are 2 different sizes of these 2-pin connectors, right? The most common one is like this, which is a 0.78 millimeter connector. There's also some which you'll most commonly find on KZ IEMs, which is a 0.75 millimeter connector. The difference is just, as far as I understand, the diameter of these pins right here. So if you're using a 0.78 cable on an IEM that uses a 0.75, it's going to be really tight, probably like what this was, and it might not even go on completely. And the inverse would be that if you're using a 0.75 IEM or cable on an IEM that requires a 0.78, it's probably going to be really loose and it'll probably just kind of fall off of the cable itself. So probably not the best match. That said, again, the 0.78 versus 0.75, 0.78 is by far the most common. I really only encounter the 0.75s when I've been dealing with KZ IEMs. So mostly not something you need to worry about. And even this QDC style here is also kind of rare. The most common ones are definitely these other ones that I showed you at the beginning. Now, what are some pros and cons of these connectors? For me, the pros is just that it's super easy to use. Let me pull this out just to kind of highlight. You know, sometimes they can be a little bit tight, but it's pretty obvious how these things function. You push in the 2 pins, they snap into place, voila, you're done. So I like that. The other thing that I think is probably the biggest pro for 2-pin is honestly, they're just super common. They're the most common connector you find out there. So it's very easy to find replacement cables, or if you buy one IEM and you want to swap cables from one IEM to the other, you know, it being common means that they're very, very compatible, and I like that. Then the other thing that I really like about 2-pin connectors, which is kind of subtle, and there might actually be some difference of opinion in this, but I like that it doesn't rotate. So the other connectors I'm going to show you, I'll be able to show you when I show you them, but they rotate on the axis of the connector, whereas the 2-pin is very solid and stable on its connector. While rotating might sound like it's a benefit, like there's some flexibility in the fit there, and again, to some degree there is. I think some people will prefer that. I generally prefer the stability of a 2-pin connector. It's just, it doesn't move around. I don't have to reposition it every time I take the earphones off and put them back on my ears. So for me, that is definitely a benefit of 2-pins. Now, what are the cons of a 2-pin connector? I think they are, you know, there's some concern that these things can bend, and I'll punch in here just to kind of highlight. These are quite thin pins, and it is possible to bend them, especially if you're using, you know, again, if you had this sort of connection here, you can imagine there's quite a lot of potential torque that you can add on this pin that would result in it bending and just could break off inside of the IEM. I've seen that before, but what I will say is that it has never really ever been an issue for me. The bigger issue that I have encountered sometimes is just that these 2-pin connectors can go loose over time. The more you use them, they can go loose, but there's also, I don't know enough about the manufacturing process, because like some IEMs I will use for years and never have problems with them, but sometimes they can go loose. And because of that, it just means, you know, sometimes you pull these things out of the box or out of your storage and the connector's a little bit loose. Sometimes I've had them actually fall off while they're on my ears. So yeah, that is a little bit of I would say actually probably a significant downside, maybe the main downside of a 2-pin connector. But the other downside is another one that you're probably not thinking about. Like, this is one that most people don't think about, and you don't generally have to think about it, but it's polarity matching. And to highlight what I'm talking about here, I thought I pulled out a cable here to show you, but let's, I'm not finding the cable that I pulled out to show you. So we're just gonna do it with this one. So basically, something to note about these cables. So these 2 pins, right? One of these is positive and one of these is a ground connection, right? And that kind of determines the polarity of the electrical signal that's going through the IEM, which is a long way of saying, and let me show you with this one. It's a long way of saying, like, if I have this IEM connected this way, which is how it normally should be connected, this will be like the correct polarity, right? But if I take this IEM and I push it on this way, the opposite direction, you'll now have an inverted polarity on this IEM. What are the effects of that? In terms of sound, honestly, I don't know, some people debate about it. I can't tell the difference between inverted versus normal polarity on sound, except for if the left and the right channels are not matched, in which case you can absolutely tell the difference and it sounds wrong, okay? You do not want one of your cables or one of your IEMs attached with the correct polarity, and I'll just do this one backward on purpose to kind of show you. You do not want to listen to the IEM like this. If you want to play around with it for yourself, by the way, I actually recommend testing it out just so you know what having mismatched polarity sounds like. But you can also, you know, flip it around and listen to it like this, even though this won't fit quite quite right. You can try that out and see what it sounds like to have inverted polarity on both sides. Again, I can't really hear the difference. I can't hear the difference. I shouldn't even caveat that with the really. To me, it makes no difference, but you can see that makes a difference for you. But that is just to highlight that there is the potential that you can mismatch the polarity on these things. So a couple of tips to address these things we've just been talking about. While we're on the topic of polarity, something I can highlight for you is just zoom in on this cable, and you can see that on one side of the protrusion, you see how there's a groove there, but there's not a groove on that side? This typically indicates that this one should be facing outside, right? So when I put this onto the IEM, the groove should be facing toward the outside. And if you do that for both sides, you should make it so that the polarity is matched and there won't be a problem. Again, you could also do it the opposite way. You can make it so that the groove is facing on the inside, but as long as you do it on both sides equally, it shouldn't be a problem, apart from the hooks being on backward. But there are cables out there that don't have preformed ear hooks, which does make this point relevant. It was actually why I was hoping to have that cable on hand. I don't know what I did with it. But anyway, so that's one tip to deal with the polarity. The other thing to deal with is, okay, we talked about, sometimes the pins can go loose over time and the IEM can fall off of the pin. To give you a quick tip for what you can do about that, I mean, probably there's a chance that you can buy a new cable and that will solve the problem, but there's also a chance that the problem is actually with the connector on the IEM going loose over time. This is usually where like the friction maintenance mechanism is. And well, there's not much that you can do about that, but what you can do is you can take a cable like this and you can take a pair of pliers like this and just ever so slightly add a little bit of a bend to one of the cables. I recommend bending it kind of like this direction, forward or backward, just giving it a little bit of a bend, and that will add a little bit more friction that hopefully will hold the cable on to the earpiece and hopefully deal with your problem, prolong your life with that IEM for at least some meaningful amount of duration. But otherwise, yeah, I don't know, there's not a whole lot that you can do with a connector that is starting to go loose. You might have to send it in for repair or just replace the IEMs. But yeah, generally that is a high-level overview of the 2-pin connector. So what about MMCX? MMCX connectors, I'm going to say, are the next most common connector. They commonly will come on IEMs from brands like Dunu, or Etymotic, or File, or even Sennheiser uses MMCX a lot. And this is kind of what it looks like. Rather than having 2 different pins that plug into the IEM, it's just got one pin that, let's see if I got this on the right side. I don't. Let me grab the right side. That you just kind of push in, you get a little satisfying snap, and then it's connected. So that's kind of the gist of it. Now there are a couple different styles of MMCX. Unfortunately, it's not just as simple as MMCX, because these other ones that I highlighted, these ones actually use cables that are not compatible with this one. This example here in the Dunu, this is the most common MMCX. Most MMCX cables will be like this one and be compatible with other IEMs, but again, Etymotic and Sennheiser are exceptions here. Etymotic, their MMCX style is kind of keyed. Let me see if I can pop this off, since it's actually a bit of a tough one. Then this is, I guess, getting into one of the cons of MMCX, is it can be a little bit of a pain in the butt to use. But you can see that the MMCX connector here on the Etymotic has this little plastic protrusion here, which aligns with this recess in the earphone, which means that it can only go on one way, which, adds some stability to that, but it does also mean that you can't use this cable on other IEMs, and you can't use other IEM cables on this one. Kind of a similar thing for Sennheiser, although it's not so much of a keying and a protrusion, it is just that there's like a missing sleeve here on the Sennheiser connector, and because of that, you need, well, actually they've kind of like moved the sleeve here. So it's a little bit more recessed, which maybe, again, adds a little bit of stability to it, but it also means that this MMCX cable is not compatible with this IEM, and this IEM is not compatible with this cable. A bit of a pain in the butt, but that's kind of the general overview of MMCX. Now, the pros of MMCX is just that it is very secure. As you kind of just saw me trying to pry these cables off of the earphones, it takes some force, which means that they're not going to come loose over time, as I was talking about with the 2-pin connectors. So that is definitely a plus here. I would say, again, it's also fairly common, so that's nice for it. And the other thing that's nice about these connectors is that there's only one way to connect them, right? I was just talking about the polarity mismatching that you can get with a 2-pin connector, because you can ostensibly add a 2-pin connector or put it on backward. With MMCX, there's only one way for it to go on, right? There's no left and right, or there's no front and backward on this thing. So you can't screw that. So that is quite nice. And then I guess the last thing I'll say as a pro, but I'm also going to say as a con, is the fact that they do rotate. So this is kind of what I was talking about with the 2 pins being stable and not rotating. The MMCX connector does rotate, which for some people is a boon, because it means you can put it in your ear, you can rotate it and get the fit nice and tight and snug. For me, I don't like it. So I'm actually going to say that for me, the rotation is actually a con for the MMCX, because it will just change place. Sometimes I'll pull the IEMs out of my storage and it's on backwards, so I have to like correct that. It just makes it more fiddly, but also it makes it less stable in my ear. This is a good example of one where it's actually pretty stiff and it doesn't rotate freely, which is good, but there are some MMCX connectors that are pretty loose, and I generally just don't like that. So that's a con for me. But probably the bigger cons are going to be that, okay, it is nice and secure, but it can be a little bit hard to remove, as I was talking about. Sometimes they can actually be really, really hard to remove, and I'll give you some tips on how to do that in a bit. But the other bigger issue is just that MMCX has kind of a reputation for going bad. I think, some people will say that this connector was not made for IEMs, and that means that it goes bad more commonly than the other connectors. What I'm going to say is, I have not had very many MMCX cables go bad on me. So for me, I'm not that concerned about them going bad. That said, you might want to limit the number of times that you remove the cable and put it back on with an MMCX, because that is something that can go bad, and it has happened with me. I do have this kind of running hypothesis that the bad reputation of MMCX is almost entirely because of the Tin Hi-Fi T2, which is a very common MMCX-based IEM from a few years ago, that I feel like that cable had a tendency to go bad, and that has kind of soured the performance of MMCX in a lot of people's eyes. But I digress a bit. Anyway, some general tips for using MMCX. Like I mentioned, they can be a little bit hard to remove. So there are some companies that HiFiGo and Final Audio make different tools for removing MMCX connector. This is an example of one where you can insert it here and ostensibly push it in. I'll be honest, I don't really use these things. These things do not make my life easier. There is the Final Audio one. It's like a plastic kind of alligator clip. That one is a little bit more useful, but I feel like even then, it's just, I don't know, am I gonna go hunt for this tool every time I need to do it? No, I'm not. So here's my pro tip on how I remove MMCX connectors, and generally I just don't have an issue with it because once I learned this. Basically, you just need to pinch it kind of, down near the base as close as possible, and apply a little bit of torque kind of left and right to it, right? Don't just pull it straight out. You want to apply just a little bit of torque to the side of it, right? So you almost give it like a slight twisting motion, and usually it'll pop right out and it won't be a big issue for you. So that's kind of my pro tip for using MMCX. But then again, I guess the last tip, I've already talked about this, maybe limit the number of times that you do that with MMCX, because it does have a bad reputation for going bad. So those are 2-pin and MMCX, but there is one other style of connector. It's actually two styles, which we'll talk about, that tries to have the best of both worlds, but doesn't. So these IEMs use a cable called an IPX connector. There's also the Pentaconn connector, which is what we're using over here. They are not the same connector. IPX and Pentaconn are two different styles, although I will say IPX is also sometimes called a T2 connector. Sorry if that's confusing. So IPX/T2, that's these two, Pentaconn over here. But I've got them both on the table, not because they're compatible, but because they do a lot of the same things. So just to kind of show you, this is what an IPX connector looks like. It's kind of like an MMCX, right? But it's extra small, which isn't necessarily the point. The point more is just so they're easier to use. You can see that plugging it in and out is a lot less friction, a lot less force required. And I think the promise here is that because there's less force and less friction, that it should be more durable. Like an MMCX, you can see that it rotates on the connection. But that is generally the gist of this connector. So this is just kind of another example of an IPX connector. And again, sometimes these things are called T2 connectors, but they are the same, right? So I can take this connector, I can plug it into this earphone, which it was not made for, because these are all intercompatible. Over here, we've got the Pentaconn connector. And this is pretty much only common. The only IEMs I've seen these things on are Elysian brand IEMs. I'm sure there are other companies out there using a Pentaconn connector, but this is pretty much it. And it's basically just an IPX connector that's a little bit bigger. You can see, actually, let me pull in that IPX. And I guess I should have also highlighted that IPX, I've seen these cables on, frankly, a lot of professional brands, like 64 Audio has it on their Aspire series as well as their customs. I think Westone uses the IPX connector. This is an Etymotic IEM that happens to use the IPX connector. So it's kind of in like the professional area, whereas this Pentaconn connector is, again, I've only seen it on Elysian, but very similar. It's got a simple push-on mechanism, simple pop-out. It is got a decent, it's got a little bit of friction on there, so it holds itself in place, but it's not so hard to put on like the MMCX cables that you need a tool or you think you might need a tool. And then like the other ones, again, it rotates. So these are pretty similar to the IPX. The pros are that it's very secure, doesn't fall out. That's good. The other pro is that, like MMCX, there's only one way to put it on. You can't get that wrong. So that much is good. And supposedly it's also good for durability. And I'm saying supposedly because, well, these just are not very common. So if there are problems with this style of connector, there's just not as many people out there complaining about it on the internet. So I'll say that's tentative, that they are better in durability. And then again, they do rotate, which for me is, well, for some people it might be a pro, for me it is a con, which I guess we'll get into the cons. So the cons are that it rotates. I don't like that personally. Honestly, the number one problem with these cables is just that they're uncommon, right? So I have literally hundreds of IEMs. I only have a handful that use these cables. So if I got a new IEM with one of these cables and the cable went bad, I'm gonna have to go out of my way to find a new cable. I'm not just gonna have one on hand. And it's probably not gonna be available at the normal places where you would buy cables. Are kind of a pain in the butt to find. And you're just gonna be very limited in what you can find. And then the last point is just that, again, these things are so uncommon that I don't know actually what the other cons are. I don't use these things daily very often, and I don't know many people that do. So what are the other cons? Maybe none. Maybe that's it. So as far as like tips, I also kind of don't have a lot of tips on how to use IPX and Pentaconn connectors. The one tip I will give you is that where you can find them, where you can buy them. A cable like this, right? If you need a replacement IPX cable, I saw that 64 Audio sells them, as well as Etymotic sells one. What is the name? The name of this brand is like called Linum, I believe. The Linum Bax cable. It's kind of a pain in the butt as a cable, but if you need a replacement, there you go. So you can get that. And then if you need the Pentaconn connectors, the only place I really know of, I guess there's maybe a couple places, there's Knoll Audio sells cables. I think you can get them in a Pentaconn connector, but then this is, of course, an Effect Audio cable. And Effect Audio does a lot of their cables available in HiFiGo, of course, linked in the description, where the connector here is actually replaceable. And you can take one that's MMCX, swap it over to become a Pentaconn connector, and that is one way that you can find replacements. But apart from that, that's kind of all the tips I got. So that's where we're at currently with IEM cable connections. There's some pros and there's some cons to kind of all of them. But like I mentioned up top, I have a suggestion for a better way. But to start, just to kind of recap the different types of connections and their pros and cons, 2-pin connectors, in terms of compatibility, they are super, super common. So it's very easy to take a cable from one IEM and use it on another. I like that. I think that is super important. They're also pretty easy to use. There's plug and play. There's no pushing and pulling like there is with the MMCX. In terms of fit stability, I like that they don't rotate. So that's a bonus for me. The only downside with 2-pin is there are some issues with durability. They can go loose either over time or even just a brand new one can be, depending on how you're using it, it can get loose. MMCX, well, it's somewhat common, not quite as common as 2-pin, but I would say generally a pretty common style. In terms of ease of use though, like I highlighted, they can be pretty difficult to put on your IEM and especially to take off. So that's somewhat of a downside. For me more so though, it's just I don't like the fact that they rotate, and then because there is so much friction, because they are so hard to put on and off, they can have some durability issues. They can go bad over time. So MMCX is definitely not my favorite. IPX and Pentaconn, they tried to make up for some of the issues with MMCX, but unfortunately they're just uncommon. And that to me makes it kind of a non-starter. I don't think creating a new standard, establishing a new standard, and hoping to get to the ubiquity of 2-pin is likely to happen. They are easy to use, which is nice. You know, they're definitely much easier to use than MMCX, but they do still rotate. And while they claim to be better for durability, I just don't know enough people using them daily to really know if, in practical experience-wise, that holds up. So that's kind of where we're at. But again, like 2-pin is almost there. The only downside with 2-pin is that it's just not the most stable and secure of a connection. So if we can address that, I think we might have something. And that's where my idea comes into play, all right? I have a little sketch here. And just to start with, this diagram here is I'm drawing the two different parts of a 2-pin connection, right? Up top, we have the bit that goes in the cable, right? Where you have your pins that come out of it. This is the top part of the 2-pin connection. And then of course you have the corresponding receptacle. This is the part that is built into the IEM where the 2 pins enter and that creates that friction and holds it in place. So this is just kind of where we're at. And what I'm proposing is a modification that we can call tentatively the super pin. And this is the gist of it, right? We'll take that top bit and we don't have to make a drastic change to it, but I'm just proposing that we add little detents or little grooves into the pins. And then on the receptacle end, we add these little springs kind of built into the sleeves that receive those pins. And then what you would have is then you would have a, let's see if this works. I've got a janky false animation here. Basically, you would have it so that when you insert the 2-pin connector, those little grooves align with the springs, and now you have a much more secure connection there that is not going to go loose over time. And that, I think, is a game changer if we can make it work. And just to kind of highlight for you, this is very viable. This is like a Sennheiser HD 600 cable. And just to show you, they use a similar 2-pin system that also has a groove built into it. And this groove gives you that extra stability. Now, what I really like about this solution isn't just the extra stability that we get from that, because we could invent an entirely new connector and do that as well. What I like from this solution, though, is that this does not disrupt any of that compatibility with other 2-pin cables that I was talking about, all right? So over here on the left side, we have just, again, our super pin top and our super pin receptacle. Obviously, this is gonna work. But to highlight, you could have an IEM that has not been upgraded to a super pin receptacle. You could still use a cable that has super pin pins. It's still gonna work. It's still gonna have the same 0.78 millimeter connector. This is still gonna have the same level of friction and the same level of stability you get with normal 2-pin. Or over here, you could have an IEM that has been upgraded to a super pin receptacle, but you could still use a normal 2-pin cable. There would be no problem with this. You would still have the same amount of friction, and it would still have the same level of stability that you have with a standard 2-pin connection. Of course, when you combine a super pin receptacle with a super pin pin, that's when you get the full benefit of the added stability. And this, I just think, is like exceedingly viable. Like, I think someone can do this. I can't do this. I'm not a manufacturer. But I think this is viable, and I would love to see manufacturers go in this direction. And that is everything that I know about IEM connectors, both the ones that do exist and the ones that, frankly, I wish existed. Thanks again to HiFiGo for making waveguide videos like this possible. If you want to buy your next IEM cable, HiFiGo has them all, including the Pentaconn cables, which I'll have linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, also linked down below. And I'll catch you in the next super review. Cheers.
Joined with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the future.